warm welcome to this webinar that's being organized by the Center for Teaching and Learning at IIM Bangalore. Our two guests today need absolutely no introduction. Our keynote speaker for the online discussion is Dr. Shashi Tharoor. He's a third-time Member of Parliament from Thiruvananthapuram, a best-selling author, former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, and a former Minister of State for Human Resources Development and External Affairs of the Government of India. The moderator for the session also needs no introduction, Mr. Shekhar Gupta, celebrated Indian journalist and author. He is the founder and the current editor-in-chief of The Print. So welcome, Dr. Tharoor and Mr. Gupta, and thank you for taking the time to be with us here at IMB. So the topic for today is NEP a game changer for higher education? And so without further ado, I hand over the proceedings to Mr. Gupta. Thank you again.
Well, thank you very much. And I'd say I'm happy, but I'm also sobered by the thought of having to moderate Shashi Tharoor.
How about that moderate, Shekhar?
So Shashi, welcome to this conversation. In fact, I'm looking forward to learning from you also. And you raised a question in our preliminary talk when you said a lot of the education policies about early education, primary education, school education, and the questions seem to be all about higher education. But the fact is that that the subject itself is the implications for higher education, the future of higher education. Right. Nevertheless, if you want, you can have a little introduction to the subject, and you can make this point reminding everybody that I know that it takes a lot of time to get to IIM, and by that time you are getting the highest of the higher education. But a lot more should have happened before that, and that is also what NEP is about, and we should not forget that. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Shekhar. I thought, in fact, we'll have more of an exchange amongst ourselves. So I really won't say a lot. I mean, I've been a huge advocate of revising the 1986 National Education Policy since my own days in MHRD. So even in Parliament, I welcomed the decision of this government to announce a new education policy in 2020. Though I must say that it was disappointing that it took the Modi government 6 years to grasp the nettle, and that they didn't have any extensive discussions in Parliament about it. And my broadest observation about this is that the challenge is to ensure that aspirations are matched by implementation. We've had, for example, the goal of 6% of GDP to be spent on education, which was first articulated in 1948, reiterated by the Kothari Commission in the 1960s. Every government has articulated this target, and every government has then had to face up to its own finance ministry. And in the last 6 years, the Modi government's expenditure in education, 7 years, has declined in real terms. It's closer to 3% of GDP. How it's going to reach 6%, I don't know. And so my wariness about a lot of the broad issues here, even while applauding the fact that we have a policy, is my wariness that that the gap between announcement and fulfillment, between rhetoric and reality, in so many areas of this government's work has been so stark that I fear something similar happening in this extremely vital and necessary area. Now, we can go into more details. I just wanted to add a footnote, as we talked about before the event, that there is, of course, a real challenge in school education, where I think the new education policy, frankly, is much more deficient. I actually like more of the things in the higher education policy than I do in the school education. For example, placing the burden of pre-primary education on overstretched, underfunded, and under-equipped Anganwadis is utterly disastrous, where there are not even enough resources right now to run the Anganwadis properly, and there are no additional resources envisaged. And on top of that, the qualification of Anganwadi workers is 12th standard pass. How on earth are you going to get these people to actually give robust pre-primary preparation for a child is extremely worrying. So starting from that stage, right through with issues of foundational literacy and numeracy, evaluation, teachers for schools, the multidisciplinarity of schools, the resources required to maintain a lot of things. But I know we're not here to discuss school policy. I just want to say that my bigger worries are about that earlier part of the way in which the new education policy has conceptualized that part of it. And, we as public policy practitioners have to be concerned about the public system, the government system, state schools. And those are the ones that are most vulnerable. And, you can't blithely have a bureaucrat writing a policy saying that if individual schools are not able to meet the requirements of the Right to Education Act in terms of facilities, then you can have a cluster of schools that offer these facilities. Now, okay, if there are 7 or 8 schools in a rural area or in 2 districts adjoining, and one of them only has a swimming pool, fine, that makes sense. But if you're talking about the fact that 3 of those schools don't have toilets for girls, that's not fine, because a cluster of schools, it's not realistic to expect a girl student to leave one school, travel 10 kilometers to another school to go to the toilet. She'll instead go home and she'll never come back. And this kind of thing has created serious dropout problems, particularly for girls of a certain age. So all of these things are the school level. Now, on the higher level, I'm yours, and I'm very happy to respond to your questions.
Well, 2 points come out of what you've said as yet. Number one, just lack of debate in Parliament. Something like this should have been debated. Do you miss the fact that this wasn't debated threadbare in Parliament and sort of came top down?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I must say I had the benefit of a good couple of hours one-on-one with Minister Ramesh Pokhriyal Nishank, and therefore some of my inputs were listened to. But that's not true of the vast majority of our MPs. And I think that it would have been good to have had this as an item for discussion during one of the sessions last year, and we never did. The only opportunity MPs had to address the issue was in the demands for grants of the Ministry of Education. And certainly I took the opportunity to make some points there. A handful of other MPs did as well, but it fell a long way short of a structured discussion on the policy, because it was mainly about the money. And on the money, frankly, there is a great deal of concern and skepticism that this government has given, is going to give enough money to the education process. I mean, I may as well, since I've raised the issue, give the numbers and get out of the way. Expenditure on education as a percentage of the union budget has declined from 4.14% in 2014-15, when we had just left power, to 3.2% in 2021, and it'll be closer to 3% in 21-22. Now, this is bad enough, but then if you look at expenditure on education by the center and the states together as a proportion of GDP, it has actually been stagnant at about 2.8% throughout the Modi regime. So we've got a government in a policy talking about 6% of GDP going towards education, and in practice it has struggled to maintain 3%.
And it's not as if the GDP has been growing by 8%, 9%, 10%. So your pie will go up. GDP has actually been growing very slowly. On a net basis, I think it's stagnant since 2019, even if you get a 10% growth here this year. So that's where we are. And also, if I may remind you that the minister lost his job shortly afterwards.
Unfortunately, I gather it was for health and not because of anything else. But that is a problem, because he was the one who was immersed in this with his bureaucrats for 2.5 years, and suddenly he's gone. And the new minister will have to learn the ropes and in order to ensure the implementation. And as we all know, Shekhar, in every walk of life in our country, implementation is always a bigger challenge than ideas. We're great with ideas. We are people who come up with vision all the time. How do we translate that into reality? That's where we falter. And so I do worry. I have a big worry about implementation, even of the things that I like about this policy.
See, we are having this conversation in a week where India's higher education power is being celebrated, with now Parag Agrawal taking over as CEO of Twitter, and you see these lists of Indian origin CEOs. Although sometimes I feel like reminding people that most of these guys are about as Indian as Henry Kissinger might be German. But
not fair, because almost all of them have been educated in India up to university level.
Well, yes, but you know,
that's when they were formed. After that, they may have worked abroad, fair enough. Yeah. But that's a lot more Indian than Henry Kissinger.
All right, all right. Maybe more German, maybe as German as Albert Einstein. Nevertheless, nevertheless, the fact is that India's higher education, when India's higher education is celebrated, it's IITs and IIMs. Now, the question that comes up is, why is everything done by engineers? So marketing companies are being run by engineers. Tech companies, I can understand, but everything seems to be run by engineers. In fact, even at IIMB, I'm sure if I check out the demographics, a lot of them will be engineers. A lot of the IAS now is engineers. A lot of the All India services are engineers. What does it tell us about the state of higher education? And I will give you a proposition. And the proposition is, the reason you have this IITians and IIM Walas doing so well and brilliantly all over, and the rest of us are not, that's because the basic admission system is so robust and so brutal that the best make it. And then these institutions run beautifully well. They have great faculties, they have great curriculum, they are like the great regiments, 200-year-old regiments of the Indian Army, right? Which live up to a tradition. But there is too little of this.
These are islands of excellence in a sea of mediocrity.
Yeah, but so why have we not been able to expand these islands? Why has it not become an archipelago with lots of islands close together? This is still too exclusive.
I agree with you. And yet, there is the other argument, Shekhar, which I'm sure you've also heard, that as we, and I say we because both the UPA government and the BJP NDA government have done this, we have expanded the number of IITs and IIMs. A number of professors of these institutions have said to me rather bitterly, you fellows have diluted the brand, that not all IITs now offer the quality of education that the IIT brand is associated with. Not every IIM is of the standard of the original first few IIMs, and so on. And this becomes then a challenging issue. I personally, my bias is towards expanding, creating more institutions of sufficient quality. But there may be real challenges of finding adequate human resources, qualified enough professors to be able to offer what's there. On top of that, as you know, reservation in educational institutions has gone rather politicized, and there are now problems about not being able to get people of the right caste for the right positions that are vacant and all of that. And that kind of thing is also affecting the academic excellence that these institutions strive for. So there are problems. And I think that spreading quality education across the country to multiple institutions and reaching more and more people remains indispensable, but it is still a fairly imperfect picture. I would say there are IITs still producing wonderfully successful, bright young graduates, but there are perhaps also some IITs and IIMs which are not being able to impart the same sort of education as the original lot did in the 60s and 70s.
Well, first of all, institutions take time growing and maturing. And second, they might still be better than the engineering university or technology university that a failed politician's grandson might be running somewhere.
That's true. And there's a lot of those too.
And charging very high fees. So expanding opportunity is a good thing. Yeah. Now we'll start taking some questions. Some of the questions, frankly, are a bit technical. So I don't understand. So I will just repeat them. For example, I don't know what is HEI. But I have a question. What would
higher education institutions, I'm assuming.
All right. Good. Thank you very much. I learned something new. What would be the future of higher education institutions? That is Dr. Geeta Rajaram, Professor, Finance and Strategy, Global Institute of Management Sciences.
That's another vast question, because obviously, I mean, there are some big ideas in this new national education policy that speak of a very rosy future for higher education institutions. If you look, for example, at their determination to talk about the need for world-class education, pursuit of excellence, the offer of multidisciplinarity, which is actually, I think, quite welcome, because you remember when we went to university, the choice was basically one major subject, whether it was history or English or whatever. At best, in the first couple of years, a subsidiary or two, and then basically all your main papers, and one subject, you were much more narrowly focused. Whereas the present, the new policy speaks of encouraging multidisciplinarity so that an engineer will study humanities more easily and a social science person can take a STEM course and so on and so forth. The question of expansion, access, equity, all of these are important. That's there in the language of the document. And then the emphasis on research, that's a hugely important thing for the higher education ecosystem in our country. If we want to have a culture of innovation, which is something we constantly keep talking about, we definitely need to really solidly support, encourage, and finance a high level of research. And that's where I think that the statements in the NEP say that they will create significant funding impetus and grants for research through the National Research Foundation and encourage more investments in higher education. That can't be anything but good for the HEI's future. There's also some recognition that faculty members are the most crucial aspects of good universities, and at least recognizing this suggests there may be fewer impediments in the path of universities who want to recruit and pay and attract and retain a high quality faculty. And there is a lot of talk of academic freedom and institutional autonomy. Now, I have to also say, in all fairness, there's a lot of skepticism about this talk. The document talks about the significance of academic freedom and institutional autonomy in funding, in curriculum development, in student admissions and faculty recruitment. But at the same time, there are all sorts of other things happening at the same time. For example, there is a great emphasis by the Modi government on common entrance examinations across the board. So where on the one hand, you talk about institutional autonomy, on the other hand, you tell the institution you're allegedly granting autonomy to, that they can only admit students on the basis of a national exam that the ministry is going to be conducting or an agency of the ministry is going to be conducting. That seems to me somewhat contradictory. If there is academic autonomy, then each college should be free to take the people it wants to take, because in fairness, the logic would be there'll be enough colleges in the country that others who get left out of this process. I mean, why do we have, let me just back up from this for 1 second, explain what I mean. In the days when I went to university, I happened to have very good marks. I'll be very immodest about it. So I got into St. Stephen's even without an interview. But there are very many others who had rather poor marks, but got in after the interview because they seemed to be talented at acting or music or just came across so well in their articulation of the interview that the college believed they'd make a good, valuable addition to the debating team or whatever. And those elements were not quantified. They were just the impressions of the admission committee, and some of our most illustrious alumni got in that way. Today, or since the 90s, St. Stephen's cannot do that because there's already Supreme Court ruling saying that if you so much as interview somebody who has got 0.5% lower than the cutoff mark, then you have to interview every other applicant in the country between the person you're interviewing and the cutoff, which means as a practical proposition, they can't do it. And so they're rigidly observing the cutoff for fear of judicial penalties otherwise. Now, I mention this as an example because this is the kind of problem that has curbed the autonomy of colleges to preserve their character. The character of a college, which, for example, may have once upon a time been known for a great cricket team or a great theatrical tradition or a great debating tradition, is not going to be necessarily fulfilled if you're forced to take people only on the basis of cutoff marks, because the cutoff marks will not reveal all of those talents at all. And, St. Stephen's, which I think was in the finals of the inter-college cricket every single year in the 50s, 60s, 70s, has not even made it to the quarterfinals in the last few years when it's been forced to take people only on cutoff marks. I mentioned this as an example of something where if the institution has no freedom on whom it can recruit, then where is the real talk of institutional autonomy going? And I mean this with regard to students, though apparently they will get more freedom when it comes to recruiting faculty. The other concerns that many have mentioned, for example, research ecosystem is all very well, but if you create one national research foundation, are you likely to end up with a body that will essentially tell people what they can and cannot research? Can you imagine a national research foundation under this particular government encouraging a research project that they may deem to be subversive or anti-national or simply wrong-headed politically? So these are concerns that emerge from a perception of increasing centralization in the institutions that are envisaged to be created, which run at odds with the language of autonomy that has actually been touted as representing the future of higher education institutions. Now, I suspect that our hosts in the IIMs and the IITs genuinely have more autonomy now than they used to have. But I don't know that the autonomy touted for other universities and institutions is actually what it's made out to be.
So one IIM graduate has become the richest woman in India, right? Richest self-made woman in India.
You're referring to Kiran?
Falguni Nair, right?
Okay.
Falguni Nair. One IITian has just become CEO of one more big global tech company. So, and also this platform is at an IIM. So there is a risk that we will get overweighted towards technical education. And most of the questions are like that. But because you talked about research that might be subversive and this one authority may not want it, we have to address the other issue, that is humanities education. Humanities, liberal arts, that is where India has got really left out. India is not producing any economists anymore in India.
Well, I mean, one of the comments made by, I think it was a Western economist, I'm trying to remember whom, in the 70s was, India's problem is it is cursed with an abundance of good economists.
I mean, I know
policies.
That didn't do very much for our economy then.
That's right, exactly. That was why the comment was made. But having said that, yeah, I mean, economists, you're right, but also across the board, historians. It's amazing that most of the distinguished and respected historians in the country today are above 70. Some are even writing in their 80s and 90s because there's no one really taking their space. And there are similar questions you can ask about many other fields in the humanities. And that's partially because that's not what their parents are prepared to channel their kids. Shekhar, I find myself giving away a lot of prizes at convocations, including at high school type events. And I make it a point whenever possible, when there aren't 3,000 kids to hand certificates to, but say only 30 or 40 or 100, I will ask them, so what are you going to do? What subject are you going to focus on? And I'm appalled. I mean, I never find anybody saying they want to study literature or history or economics. It's all the sciences. It's computer science, it's medicine, it's biology. You can imagine the subjects that today appeal to kids and that their parents are guiding them towards, because every middle-class Indian parent wants a kid to be a doctor or an engineer. So you're totally correct. We are not doing enough at all for promoting the humanities. And I'm glad that now the private sector is slightly compensating. Universities like O.P. Jindal, Shiv Nadar University, Ashoka University in Sonepat, coming up that are focusing principally on the humanities. But of course, that'll mean that you have to have an awful lot of money to begin with if you want to study the humanities.
Yeah, and people have to find jobs in places other than newsrooms where they don't get paid too much.
There you are.
Yeah. So next question, Dr. Mariam Narona. She's assistant professor of business studies at Nes Wadia College of Commerce. And she's asking, the adverse teacher-student ratio seems to have no consideration in higher education. Some teachers are handling 150 students in each class.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with her more. In fact, you probably are aware, Ms. Narona, that the government has actually cheerfully, and I would say blithely announced that they want to change the ratio in higher education to 50%, a 50% gross enrollment ratio in higher education, and for that matter, 100% in secondary school. I mean, this is pie in the sky stuff. Currently, it's about 25.8% in higher education. It's 68% in class 9. So are these targets any more realistic than the government's solar energy commitments at Paris or Glasgow? I don't know. I will say that when you look at the fact that they are promising essentially to enroll more kids, and they're not doing enough to expand the number of institutions in which those kids can go, inevitably each classroom is going to be bursting at the seams. I can tell you one example from the RTE. This is a school example, but it applies mutatis mutandis. And that was the fact that we had something called a comprehensive evaluation that teachers were required to do of every student, a kind of 360-degree evaluation, rather than merely giving marks for an exam. evaluate their class participation, their grasp of issues, their articulation of ideas, all sorts of things in the comprehensive evaluation. And some teachers said to me, you guys have to understand, this can work in the Western world where no classroom is larger than 20 students. I have 50 students. How on earth do you expect me to do comprehensive evaluations of 50 students every year? It is humanly impossible, even if I work till midnight every night. Please be reasonable in the goals you set. Now, the truth is these goals are set by bureaucrats, not by teachers. And the bureaucrats who are writing them are submitting them to politicians who are not teachers either. And they get there, they get announced, they're unleashed on the world, on the nation. And then, of course, they're not fulfilled, and people say, whose fault is it? They blame the teachers and the students. But in fact, Ms. Narona's question is totally correct. The number of teachers available to students is so absolutely pathetic. We need to prepare far, far more teachers. And we're not doing very well at that. In fact, if you look at the number of teachers taking the examinations to qualify to teach and how badly they are faring, then it's even worse, because what we're looking at with them is a significant number of people who just don't pass the exam to qualify as eligible for higher education opportunities. So all of these are a problem, and I think that looking at it in terms of number of students, number of teachers is one thing. Looking at the quality of the teaching the teachers are able to offer the students, given class size and everything else, is another. So we genuinely have a very, very serious problem here.
How do you make teaching more attractive for people? How do we attract more people to teaching?
That's a very good question. I actually was a big believer in trying to glamorize it a bit. I actually managed to get a TV channel interested one year in giving teaching awards, and personally gave those awards myself when I was in the ministry. It lasted just that 1 year. I think they didn't get enough viewership to want to persist.
Or maybe they didn't get enough sponsors.
That too. But these are all worrying signs. Right. We have an Indian educationist in the Gulf, Sunny Varki.
But you know what? I know Sunny Varki, but you know what?
$1 million prize to the best teacher in the world.
Yes.
And an Indian won it this year. And that so it's not as if, but if we can somehow make the profession better rewarded. Now, I know that teachers will tell you their rewards are not only material or financial, but it's also true that unless you give the salaries that make it an attractive profession, you will not attract the best of the students. You'll have the occasional person who, for family reasons, genetic reasons, or just personal quirks, wants to be a teacher. But mostly, the bright students are going into the more remunerative lines of higher education and then into jobs like that. And it's the ones who don't hack it in those levels who are coming in to be teachers. And that's, again, not good either for the morale of the students or of the teachers.
Now, question from Shankar Prasad S., Assistant Professor of Public Policy at Jain University, and it's a question to be answered by somebody who's read the NEP. He says the model of institutional development plan has a challenge of designing the curriculum. Don't you think we would be creating courses without content?
Well, I mean, that depends very much on how it stands. See, in theory, the design of the curriculum are now left to the autonomous higher education institutions. So in theory, at any rate, there's nobody sitting around in some sort of university, multi-university level syndicate or some government regulatory agency telling you what you can teach, what you can prescribe on the syllabus, what students have to learn. In principle, you can do this at your own level. And therefore, if you're doing it at a university level, you know what are the outcomes you want, what are the learning outcomes you want, what are the kinds of quality you want to produce out of your students. So you should be able to come up with some with content. I mean, part of the inbuilt logic, even if it isn't spelt out of this approach, is that the marketplace is eventually going to rule. If you produce students who are useless and unemployable, more students will not come to you. And because you're autonomous, only you will get the blame. It won't be the system, it'll be you. And thereby your university will go down and some other university will attract better people. That's sort of the implicit logic of the autonomy approach. And that applies to curriculum development. So if some students want to go to a college because it has such a very undemanding curriculum that they feel they'll have an easy time, then that will soon become the reputation of the college. And only maybe the rich party kids will want to go there. Whereas if you have a demanding curriculum with full of depth and substance, and that your degree is considered something that employers will respect and the marketplace will respect, that will increase again your reputation and attract more students. So that seems to be part of the logic that's been built up here. And when they talk about creating, encouraging the pursuit of excellence and creating a world-class education, that's what this should actually end up producing.
Yeah. I have Professor Ausif TP, Associate Professor of Economics and Finance at XIME. I presume X is for Xavier's. I don't know what the rest is for.
Institute of Management, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So he wants to know what method should be adopted to encourage postdoctoral research. He said most people, even if they are researching, once they get the PhD, they are done with it. And there are lots of them, particularly in your profession, which is politics, who can get PhDs and DSCs and DLITs without even passing maybe class 5. And,
that's a different matter.
And they are the ones who use the doctor prefix most of all.
Look, I got my PhD the hard way, let me stress. But
that we know. So this is not a reference to you. This is a reference.
I just wanted to place it on record, since you're right that my profession is full of fake doctors who insist on being called that too, which I don't. But let me just say that as we come back to the question of postdoctoral research, you really need to broaden the thing to a larger ecosystem of academia industry interface. When UPA was in power, we asked Narayana Murthy ji, the Infosys' Narayana Murthy, to do a study on this, and he wrote an excellent report which has largely gathered dust in the Modi regime. And I think what is worth looking at about this is his emphasis on the fact that we should actually create a greater degree of sort of permeability between the marketplace in the form of modern industry and the educational sector. So, for example, if we had a culture, as is very common in the US, that a company goes to a top-notch education institution and says, we have this idea, we don't have the personnel to research it and see if it works and can be brought to market. If you have a bunch of postdocs who can take this on as a project, we'll fund them, we'll give them their scholarships and all of that, and they can live and work on campus and do this research. And then they produce a product, we will share the profits or the royalties or whatever with the institution, with them and with ourselves. And that kind of thing is very common in America. It's practically unknown in India. Now, if you started doing this more systematically, the government encouraged people to do this. The government gave even tax incentives for companies to do this. There'll be more and more opportunities for postdocs who want to stay. Right now, if you're finished your doctorate, the pressure on you from everybody, starting with your family, is to go and get a job. You know, what are you doing now hanging? You've been around the campus long enough, go off and kuch kamao. Whereas if you are in an environment where you can actually continue your academic inclination and research while also making a decent sort of sum of money as a fellowship research assistant, will be higher than just a student would normally get, plus the opportunity to translate that into some marketable innovation or product, you might well have attracted a lot more people to stay on and do this. By the way, a lot of Indian postdocs who are serious about this kind of thing go abroad. So
right.
We don't have many postdocs in India, but there are many Indian postdocs away. And I'm hoping that some of the new institutions that we've tried to bring on stream, an institution like ISA, the Indian Institute for Science Education Research, that institutions like this will actually provide more incentives for people to want to stay on and do significant research. Again, these institutions are just establishing themselves. I mean, ISA goes back to UPA 2, so there's still time for these things to come on stream. But I certainly agree with the implicit assumption in the question that we need to create facilities and ecosystems to make that kind of thing much more possible.
There is Professor Bharti Adkoli from the National College Autonomous Jayanagar, Bangalore, who wants to know, how can India control brain drain? First of all, do you believe in brain drain? Do you believe there is such a thing as brain drain?
No, I think there was and there isn't. There was in the sense that I think I'll be very honest and say that in the days of the somewhat more protectionist India we knew in the 60s, 70s, even up to the early mid 80s, that we did have a brain drain in the sense that a lot of our best talents coming out of highly subsidized, high quality education in IITs and medical colleges were going abroad. not coming back and not contributing at home. And that therefore was constituted a net drain. You spent your taxpayers' money training these people, and some other countries getting all the benefit of it, or some private companies getting the benefit of it, you are not. I think that's changed, and it's changed in interesting ways. The first is that many of these people, as they rose to dizzying heights, including of dizzying levels of prosperity and profit in their new homes, woke up to their sense of commitment and obligation back home, and they started turning their attention towards their home country. So in India, we saw a remarkably interesting level of giving back from the people who had been the part of the brain drain. They were investing, they were donating. Some of it is pure philanthropy, but much of it was creating institutions and so on in our country. I've come across so many, for example, former IITians in America who have opened either schools in their traditional villages or colleges for women, or have given big grants to the institutions from which they've graduated and so on. Secondly, especially once we liberalized in the 90s, Shekhar, you started getting investments in companies in India. So the people who you were criticizing as having drained away from us were actually giving back in terms of institutions and companies in India that in turn were able to generate far more jobs and far more money and far more wealth for us, as well as create the entire sort of, or much of the business processing and offshoring businesses of the late 90s and early part of the century, which in many, many cases were alimented by funding from our so-called brain drain. So I would say that by the 90s, the brain drain started becoming a brain gain. And that's why today, if I were in a public policy position in government, I would not discourage our kids from going abroad if they wanted to after they've learned, because I would be confident that in 90% of the cases, they will give back. Now, there will be 10% who won't, and that's something, every business has to accept a certain amount of loss, and that's something that this country will also have to accept. But I wouldn't want to repress people and keep them in our country against their will, because by going abroad, they discovered new concepts, new businesses, new ways of doing things, new technologies that they wouldn't have been able to do in the limited opportunities and resources available in India. And so what they contributed to us later, they could never have contributed if they hadn't left. That's my logic.
Yeah. We have Malvika Binni. She teaches history at SRM University. And her question is about the 4-year degree program. And she says, how will it help our students, particularly the ones from less privileged sections? Would it not lead to more dropouts since they will get a certificate after every year?
No, so that actually, to be honest, I don't dislike this at all. I actually like it. And I'll explain to you why. I mean, it's one of the problems with the education system we had is it became a question of how many years, rather than actually what you learn, what your learning outcomes are, and how useful what you learned is for what you want to do in life. Now, with the 4-year degree, first of all, you've reduced schooling by 1 year. So it's going to be 5 + 3 + 3 under the NEP, no longer 10 + 2. So it'll be 11 years of schooling and then 4 years of university, rather than 12 years of schooling and 3 years of university. So you're still ending up with the same 15. It's just structured differently. And the second point to bear in mind is that when somebody comes into college, they are not necessarily fully formed, especially if they haven't gone to a terribly good school. They may not be very clear what they want to do. Many of us kind of sleepwalked through the initial processes of getting into college and getting started in what we were doing. I think it's important for us to understand that here, kids can be far more self-aware. There is the possibility after 1 year of realizing you just can't hack it and leaving and moving, for example, into a vocational stream, which again has been given emphasis in this document. But sadly, again, the emphasis is rhetorical. There's no tangible action plan for creating a viable series of vocational outlets. We can talk about that if you want later. At the end of a second year, you'll get what used to be the old intermediate in the days of our grandparents. And then we go into the third year, which would essentially be the equivalent of what today in Delhi University would be called a BA pass. So you'd basically get a pass degree, you'd be qualified to call yourself a bachelor, but you would not be recognized as somebody of a sufficient level of academic excellence to be eligible for further higher studies. So you'd have to do the 4th year to get an honors degree, and to be eligible for a master's or a PhD or research work or anything else. And I think that actually makes sense. Not everybody is equally intellectually equipped or interested. So why subject everybody to the same 3 years? Give them, I think, multiple points of exit. And I'm personally not at all against what they've come up with in this particular aspect.
Now, there's a question that I don't particularly understand, one of those, because I don't know the background to it. And this is from Dr. Shivkami Rajan, Associate Professor at Presidency University. While you were at the UN, did you oppose educational diversity?
Good God, good grief. No, I was a big fan of it.
Plead guilty.
Diversity is my middle name, Sheikh. I've been standing for diversity in everything I do and write all over the world, and certainly in India, and including in my politics. My big critique of the government is its lack of respect for our diversity. And my last book before this one, the Battle of Belonging, was precisely about a concept of nationalism and nationhood that embraced diversity versus the kind of nationalism propagated by our Hindutva friends. So diversity is very much my thing. And when I was at the UN, for example, I was asked for 3 or 4 years to be the patron of the Frankfurt Book Fair, where they had an annual literacy day. And I was a strong advocate of increasing literacy in the developing world and for recognizing the importance of different diverse experiences in people. So I don't know where the question particularly comes from, but no, I was never an opponent of diversity.
Okay, Anirudh Deshpande, Professor of History at Delhi University. How will increased privatization of education, especially higher education, serve the cause of social justice enshrined in the Indian Constitution? Will affirmative action be part of the privatization of university education?
I certainly hope so, because to my mind, this is a real worry. The first worry we all have is that the cost of good education could go up. And, none of us, I think, in the public policy sphere will want to see a situation in our country where you have to have money to be able to get a good education. Even in capitalist America, that's not the case. There are means and merit scholarships at pretty much every higher education institution in America. If India is in a position to guarantee that, then I would have less of a problem with the increasing privatization of education. If every private institution were told that any student who has the quality to get in but doesn't have the means to pay for it will be eligible for scholarships that the university will itself provide, which is very common in the US, then only I think will it be fair. Otherwise, I'm really, really worried that you will end up in a situation where good education becomes unaffordable and affordable education is not good. That would be really, really.
So there is a follow-up question to this. These are linked. And this is from Dr. Anu Satyal, Associate Professor of Economics and Public Policy at College of Vocational Studies, Delhi University. And she wants to know, how do we ensure access with increased privatization? Because privatization will happen.
Yeah. How do we? That is partly answered in my earlier question, to which I'd add one more element, which is that in addition to sort of making it illegal, as it were, to deny people merely because of lack of resources, we need to be able to create processes in which a certain amount of diversity is built in. Now, the RTE, for example, that UPA passed, required schools to take 25% kids from the economically weaker sections. And I think most people will tell you it hasn't worked. Where it's been successful, it's because the schools have really made a serious effort to accommodate these kids, cover all their costs so they don't feel left out, even getting them uniforms and books and so on. And those kids are going to be the beneficiaries of that policy, but they represent a fairly slender minority of those whom the policy was meant to benefit. So my thinking here is that the government now needs to put on a thinking cap and come back to us with some very specific proposals on access. For example, is it going to be that every private institution will have to take 25% from the economic weaker sections, as the RTE had for schools? Is there going to be something about scholarships by law? Are we going to get into the whole reservation chakkar again, which is, of course, an issue of considerable importance to large sections of the political class? A lot of these have not been spelt out in the NEP. And I think the question is fair, because one of the great triumphs of Indian higher education since 1947 has been the access question, the expansion of education to grant access to people who historically had not received higher education because of caste, because of religion, because of gender, because of living in a tribal area, whatever. Such people got into the system for the first time, literally in millennia. And that success cannot afford to be thrown away. We must persist and expand. And I might add that if we can pump more money into the government system as well, and we can offer good education in the government system to anyone who applies, that would be good. You see, right now, one of our biggest problems, Shekhar, is scarcity of places. Even government universities can't take all those who apply, obviously, because of the cutoffs and everything else. But if you really had 1,000 flowers blooming in the higher education space, as the NEP envisages, foreign universities coming in, establishing campuses, private universities opening up, all of these things really mushrooming around the country, presumably they will absorb a lot of people, and there'll be new opportunities for others in government institutions. We pour more money into government institutions, expand them, and create new government colleges. Then I think we will be able to ensure access for those who either cannot afford to or cannot get into a private higher education institution.
Dr. V. Arokia Gerald, Assistant Professor of Finance at Loyola College. When Air India can be sold out to Ratan Tata, why not IIMs and IITs?
It might happen one day. I mean, I don't know about whether the professor is partially joking or partially being critical. But at this point, frankly, the government's privatization policy leaves me somewhat mystified. I'm an advocate of privatization of money-losing enterprises and enterprises the government has no business to be in. So I'm very happy to see Air India sold. I will applaud if Ashoka Hotel is sold, or the various ITDC hotels in prime locations are sold, because I don't think the government should be in the business of actually running hotels or airlines. So that's my personal bias. But I certainly worry about throwing away institutions built with taxpayers' money that are not only profitable, but that are annually putting money into the system, that are also on the anvil and very often are on the block before the loss-making institutions. That, to my mind, is extremely difficult to justify, because the government is not only giving up the hard work of taxpayers and the assets built up, it's also foregoing future revenues it has every reason to assume it'll get, because these are companies that are making revenues every year. So now, if the government has that sort of attitude to businesses, who knows what kind of attitude they may have to highly successful IIMs. I was going to say, IIMs at the moment are totally self-sufficient. IITs, for the most part, are self-sufficient. Many of them are getting massive bequests from their alumni who've gone abroad, now earning in dollars, and are happy to give large contributions. So they don't really need that much of subvention from the government, because they actually have more and more resources coming in. And you give them the freedom to fundraise, IIMs and IITs will never go broke. And therefore, the government will have no reason to need to sell them as they had needed to sell Air India. But in my view, this government is entirely capable of selling anything.
Well, the same questioner, Professor Gerald, had also asked, why should higher education institutions like IIT, NIT, and IIM need to be supported by the government? Why can't they be self-financing?
So that, again, as I said, some of the higher education institutions which have an alumni pool that can afford to finance them can finance themselves. But how will, say, an NIT from, I don't know, Nagarkoil or Kozhikode or whatever, be necessarily able to attract the money? I mean, it's possible that an NIT also has graduates who've done as well or almost as well as an IIT. But then you get to the next level down, say a regional engineering college or whatever, something lower down than an NIT. And you may find that you have a problem in actually being able to attract those resources. And then the alternative of actually raising the fees to a level that you can be self-sustaining is calamitous, because very frankly, education in our country is a means of advancement. Let us not reduce it to something that is only available to people who are already advanced. I find that the greatest stories in India today are of the successes of people who came from humble backgrounds, and because they received a subsidized education, they were able to then excel and shine and achieve great things in life. And if you had given them an unsubsidized thing and told them they had 15 lakh fees to study engineering, they might become a thelawala or a rickshaw driver because they can never afford to go off and pay 15 lakhs a year to educate themselves. So I think affordability is extremely important as if education is going to be transformative socially in our country.
So we have a question from a school. It's a school principal, Renu Singh, principal at A4 School, Hebel. How will the language policy as envisaged in the NEP practically be implemented? Can it be implemented?
Yeah, well, in theory, yes, it can be. In practice, we already know from the 3-language formula at the national level that it hasn't been. I mean, how many North Indian schools do you know, Shekhar, which teach Tamil or Malayalam? I mean, certainly I know many South Indian schools that do teach Hindi, though not in Tamil Nadu, but in Kerala, yes, and elsewhere. The fact is that the 3-language formula is not a bad idea in conception, provided it is actually implemented, and there are either incentives for implementation or penalties for non-implementation. Fact is, there are no penalties for non-implementation. So at the moment, nobody in a Hindi-speaking state is learning a 3rd language, or if they are, it will usually be Sanskrit, which is close enough from their point of view that they can claim it's their 3rd language. But the idea that somebody from the north should be learning a South Indian language and somebody from the south should be learning a North Indian language, that concept never actually has been implemented. So, as far as I'm concerned, conceptually, it's a good idea. Will it work in practice? I have doubts because I don't think our country's track record suggests that there is enough good faith behind willingness to teach all of this.
Professor Subhash Chandra Nath from Sri Sri University, what's your view on multidisciplinary PhDs?
A PhD by definition focuses only on one subject. Obviously, if somebody comes up with a subject which cuts across 2 disciplines and it persuades a guide in each discipline to be willing to guide him, I have no problem with that either. It's just that multidisciplinarity as a concept is a controversial concept to some. I mean, I know professors who say that this merely is going to give you sort of students who have received a superficial cognitive training and not any critical knowledge of any one discipline and so on. So there will be a certain hesitation. Multidisciplinary education was raised as far back as 2009 when UPA was in power by the Yashpal Committee report that suggested IITs should go into more multidisciplinary teaching. And the IITs rejected it at that time, saying that this will dilute their potential and their standards. And obviously there's no question of imposing it on the IIT, so never got anywhere. Now, today, if you were talking about multidisciplinarity, it ought to be, it seems to me, that we don't rigidly keep people in silos, that somebody who wants to specialize in a particular field ought to be able to take a second subject or a related course or an unrelated course in a totally different field. And because he or she has the kind of mind that is interested in wide ranges of subjects. And I think that should be permitted. That's very common again in the US system. It is relatively uncommon in our system. But when you get to the PhD level, it is relatively rare in every system. Normally PhDs, look very much with a microscope at one particular aspect of a particular subject. And because of that level of granularity involved in a PhD, it is very unlikely that it can be multidisciplinary. But in a rare case, somebody wants to write a multidisciplinary PhD combining 2 otherwise unrelated fields, then like every other doctoral student, they have to persuade 2 guides that the concept is viable and that the guides are willing to guide them. On that basis, I don't see why not. I certainly think regulation should not be the obstacle. You shouldn't have somebody who has a good idea, got the intellectual heft to be able to write it, to conceive it in the first place, and to persuade professors that they can guide them on this, and then be told, sorry, it's not allowed in the regulations. That would be a shame. So I'm all in favor of regulatory flexibility to permit it, but I still think it will be extremely rare at the doctoral level.
So there's a question which I think you might like, because you were talking about this to begin with. Shaukat Azim, professor of sociology at Karnataka University. I would have supported NEP had it been implemented from below upwards. What do you say?
No, I think Shaukat Saab is right that you really need to start down. Actually, at the moment, they're starting everywhere. I mean, so in theory, schools, colleges, universities, postdoctoral research, everything is all covered in the NEP. There's nothing left out. and Anganwadis even, so preschool. Everything is covered. So in that sense, they are starting at all levels at the same time. Now, the question that comes up is, does starting mean that they are finishing also there? In other words, are we looking at a situation in which, as we've seen historically, there is more emphasis and more resources on favored subjects like, for example, engineering, medicine, higher education, and much less on some poor rural government school in a poor state? I don't know how to work in practice. As I said at the very beginning, Shekhar, implementation is going to be key. I think there are a lot more holes in the approach when it comes to school education, and I would like to see some of those holes filled and addressed. But even some common concepts, like multidisciplinarity, for example. Prime Minister in his speech introducing the NEP had said about how he loved the idea that a child can learn music and maths at the same time. Now, that's all very well, but how is the school going to provide that music and maths? Maths, you need a blackboard and a teacher. Music, you'll need the equipment. You'll need the teachers qualified to train the equipment. You'll need special rooms where that music can be played without disturbing the students in the other classes. You'll need a whole infrastructure that will cost. Who's going to pay for that cost? Are you going to put the onus on the students again, on the parents? And if so, again, are you going to restrict this kind of multidisciplinary education only to those who can afford to pay more? None of these questions have been addressed. Is the government going to get into the business of financing the NEP? I don't think so. I mean, I think the suspicion of our friends on the left that much of this is meant to be fulfilled through private activity, private investment, and privatization, that suspicion has not been belied so far. And certainly I've seen nothing in the last 2 years of budgets since the NEP was announced that has shown any significant increase in educational money. So I don't think the government is planning. The government is announcing, these wonderful, wonderful targets and objectives and policies, but they're not prepared to put their money where their mouth is.
Pradeep Siddheshwar, Professor of Mathematics at Christ University. Are we hurrying through NEP, or is this the only way to bring about change in India?
That's a tough question to answer, because the fact very much is that if you look at the question of speed in our country in implementing anything, that speed has often damned the implementation. In other words, our failure to do things efficiently and fast enough has often cursed the success of many of our best ideas. So I don't want to knock speed in and of itself. Let's have the speed. But Shekhar, the problem with this is speed is only one aspect. No, you also need the resources, which, as I said repeatedly, are seriously lacking. You need intent, you need goodwill, you need trust, you need flexibility, and you need willingness to regulate. And you also need to have some consistency of approach. As I say, you can't really impose one-size-fits-all examinations, entrance exams, qualifying exams, and so on, and then in the same breath say you're giving people autonomy when they don't have that autonomy anymore. And this kind of thing, I think we really, really will have to be conscious of in terms of implementing it. So I'm not opposed to unleashing the whole thing in one go and saying, let's go for it. But I am saying that implementation will require a certain amount of diligence and a lot of resources which have not yet been committed.
Question from students. What will be
How much longer are we up? Because I think we finished our 1 hour together.
Just a few minutes, because there's a lot of questions from students, so maybe I'll take a couple.
Okay.
What will be the effects on domestic universities or educational institutions if India sets up international educational campuses under NEP?
Yeah, I think international campuses are a good thing, Shekhar, and to the questioner, because the fact is that right now Indian parents are spending $5 billion with a B in sending their kids to study abroad every year. That's how much money India is spending in foreign exchange in foreign countries to educate our children abroad. Now, many of these kids are not the sort of high-flying geniuses who are getting top quality institutions with full scholarships. Many of these are kids from middle-class families or upper middle class, no, even just middle-class families who haven't got into the institutions of their choice in India because they're not good enough, or their marks weren't good enough, or they didn't make the cutoff or whatever, and you are being packed off to foreign countries to have the kind of education that their parents would willingly have given them in India. Now, how can we keep those people in India? Only by creating institutions where these families will be willing to send their kids. And that will happen, Shekhar, when you have more high-quality institutions available. I mean, I've witnessed at close quarters the success and growth of Jindal University. It was a gleam in a young man's eye a dozen years ago. And today it's attracting more applicants than it knows how to process. And now that means a hunger for good quality is there. Even in the case of something like Jindal, it's an extremely expensive university to go to. But you can imagine if we were to allow a Harvard or a Yale or a Columbia or even a Cornell or a Dartmouth or whatever to come and open campuses here, a lot of people would be happier sending their kids to these campuses in India and getting the same or comparable quality of education, including we'll have to have a liberal visa policy for professors to come from there for a semester and teach here and all these things. It seems to me that it'll actually be good for the country. So the student whose question sounded as if he or she was slightly critical about this policy should actually be reassured. If he or she doesn't feel they can afford to go to such a campus, it doesn't matter. It'll take the pressure off the campuses he does want to go to, because it'll absorb some of the students there who will otherwise be applying for the seats that he wants. So my own view is, as I said jokingly earlier, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let us have a heck of a lot more universities and colleges in India. I would frankly love to see India becoming once more the country that 1,500 years ago attracted foreign students all the way from Turkey to Korea, coming to universities like Nalanda and Vikramshila and Takshashila.
This question was from Kushal M, who's a student of finance and entrepreneurship at BNMIT. So I think, Shashi, we can go on and on. I have lots of questions, but I think a lot of the questions are very similar and we've addressed many of those areas. And maybe at some point of time, IIMB has to hold you to ransom for an entire day. Because, the problem is that there are so few people answering these questions these days. Ideally, they should be answered by the education minister or somebody in the education ministry. But, you are one MP who does his homework, who's been in the same ministry, and you are open-minded. And thank you very much for answering so many questions. We know your time is valuable because tomorrow morning you have to go and again make noise in Lok Sabha and have it adjourned as
Mahatma Gandhi statue.
Adjourned as quickly as possible.
We want to do it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor and Mr. Gupta. Very, very engaging session. And I think a lot of us come back better informed about the NEP. So thanks again. And thanks to the audience for some great questions. Good evening to all. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And I agree. Thank you to the audience for some excellent questions.
Thank you all. Fantastic questions. I learned a lot from this.
Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you.